Harlem, New York. Winter of 1967. Frank Lucas had been driving for Bumpy Johnson long enough to recognize when something was wrong. The feds were getting too close, knowing things they shouldn't know, showing up at locations only the inner circle knew about. Someone was talking. When Frank's investigation led him to Delilah Monroe, the woman Bumpy kept in a brownstone on 139th Street, he faced an impossible choice. Telling Bumpy meant destroying the old man's heart. Staying silent meant watching the empire crumble. What Frank Lucas did next would prove his loyalty beyond any doubt. And what Bumpy Johnson did when he learned the truth would remind New York why they called him the Godfather of Harlem. Some men break when they discover betrayal. Bumpy Johnson got even. Chapter 1. The Woman on 139th Street. Delilah Monroe possessed the kind of beauty that made men forget their own names and remember hers for decades afterward. She stood 5 feet 7 inches tall, with skin the color of burnished copper and eyes that shifted between amber and gold, depending on how the light caught them. Her hair fell in natural waves past her shoulders, and when she walked down the streets of Harlem in one of her custom-tailored dresses, traffic literally stopped. Taxi drivers forgot their fares. Street vendors lost track of their change. Young men on corners fell silent mid-sentence. Delilah Monroe commanded attention without ever asking for it, and she had leveraged that power into a lifestyle most women in 1960s Harlem could only dream about. The brownstone on 139th Street between Lenox and Fifth Avenue represented the physical manifestation of everything Delilah had achieved through her association with Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson. The 3-story residence featured mahogany banisters, Italian marble in the bathrooms, a kitchen equipped with appliances that most restaurants couldn't afford, and a bedroom suite on the top floor, where silk sheets imported from Paris covered a bed large enough to sleep 4 people comfortably. Bumpy had purchased the property in 1962, put in the name of a holding company that couldn't be traced back to his operations, and installed Delilah as its sole occupant with an allowance that exceeded what most Harlem families earned in an entire year. She had met Bumpy at a jazz club on 125th Street during the autumn of 1961, introduced by a mutual acquaintance who understood that the Godfather of Harlem had particular tastes, and that Delilah Monroe satisfied them completely. Their relationship developed with the peculiar rhythm that characterized such arrangements in that era. Bumpy maintained his marriage to Mamie, the wife who had stood beside him through prison sentences and gang wars and the 1,000 indignities that came with loving a man whose business existed outside the boundaries of legitimate society. Mamie knew about Delilah the way wives in that world knew about such things, with a resigned acceptance that asking questions would produce only answers she didn't want to hear. For her part, Delilah understood the boundaries of her position with crystalline clarity. She would never accompany Bumpy to public functions where his wife belonged at his side. She would never telephone his home or appear at his legitimate businesses or acknowledge him on the street if Mamie happened to be present. In exchange for these restrictions, she received financial security that most women couldn't imagine, access to a man whose power shaped the entire neighborhood's destiny, and a lifestyle that placed her among Harlem's elite, even if her status couldn't be openly acknowledged. The arrangement suited Delilah perfectly for nearly 5 years. She filled her days with shopping expeditions to Manhattan's finest stores, lunch appointments with girlfriends who envied her circumstances, and occasional afternoons at beauty parlors where women discussed neighborhood gossip while getting their hair pressed and styled. Her evenings belonged to Bumpy whenever he chose to claim them, which happened 3 or 4 times per week, depending on his business obligations. But beneath this seemingly perfect arrangement, resentments had been accumulating like sediment at the bottom of a river. Delilah had turned 32 in 1966, and the mathematics of her situation had begun troubling her in ways that disrupted her sleep and darkened her moods. Bumpy was 61 years old, his health declining from decades of stress and prison food. When he died, and Delilah had started thinking about this inevitability with increasing frequency, she would receive nothing. The brownstone belonged to a holding company. The allowance would cease immediately. She would emerge from her years as the Godfather's mistress with nothing but memories and a reputation that would make finding a suitable husband nearly impossible. These anxieties might have remained private concerns if circumstance hadn't intervened in the form of Special Agent Robert Harrigan of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. Harrigan had been building cases against Harlem's criminal organizations for nearly a decade, and he understood that the most effective path to destroying men like Bumpy Johnson ran through the people closest to them. Wives rarely cooperated because their fates remained bound to their husbands regardless of legal outcomes. But mistresses occupied a different category entirely. Mistresses could be leveraged. Mistresses had grievances that patient investigators could exploit. The approach came during December of 1965, executed with subtlety that distinguished Harrigan from cruder agents. Delilah had been Christmas shopping at Bergdorf Goodman when a well-dressed white man struck up a conversation near the perfume counter. He seemed charming and educated, nothing like the criminals who populated her social world, and when he suggested continuing their conversation over coffee, Delilah agreed without recognizing that she had just taken the first step toward a betrayal that would ultimately define her legacy. The initial conversations were innocuous, designed to establish rapport rather than extract information. Harrigan presented himself as a businessman interested in Harlem's real estate potential. He was handsome and attentive in ways that Bumpy, preoccupied with his empire's daily demands, had stopped being years earlier. Delilah found herself looking forward to their occasional meetings, enjoying attention from someone who seemed genuinely interested in her thoughts rather than merely her physical attributes. Harrigan revealed his actual identity during their fourth meeting, but by then he had gathered enough information about her circumstances to make the revelation feel like opportunity rather than threat. He understood her anxieties about the future. He recognized that women in her position rarely emerged from such arrangements with security, and he had something to offer that Bumpy Johnson never could, a path forward that didn't depend on the continued survival of an aging gangster. The deal was straightforward. Delilah would provide information about Bumpy's operations, schedules, and business arrangements. In exchange, the Bureau would establish an account in her name that would grow with each piece of valuable intelligence. The proposal appealed to every anxiety accumulating in her mind, and she agreed before fully understanding the magnitude of what she was committing to. For nearly 2 years, Delilah Monroe had been providing Robert Harrigan with information that slowly mapped the architecture of Bumpy Johnson's empire. She revealed counting house locations where daily numbers revenues were tallied. She identified legitimate businesses serving as fronts for illegal operations. She described hierarchies within Bumpy's organization. She reported on meetings she overheard during nights at the brownstone when Bumpy discussed business matters with associates who assumed their conversations enjoyed absolute privacy. None of this was known to Frank Lucas during the winter of 1967 as he drove Bumpy Johnson through Harlem streets, navigated Manhattan's traffic for business meetings, and waited in parked cars while the Godfather conducted affairs requiring privacy. Frank had been working for Bumpy for several years, had proven his loyalty through countless tests both large and small, and had earned a position of trust that few others in the organization enjoyed. He knew about Delilah, had driven Bumpy to the brownstone dozens of times, had occasionally exchanged pleasantries with the beautiful woman whose existence represented one of his employer's few indulgences. What Frank couldn't have imagined was that the woman waiting inside those walls was systematically destroying everything Bumpy Johnson had spent decades building. Chapter 2. The Cracks in the Foundation. The first indication that something was wrong arrived on a Tuesday morning in January of 1967, when federal agents raided a numbers operation in a basement on 142nd Street that Bumpy had been running profitably for nearly 8 years. The location was one of the most secure in his entire network, known only to a handful of trusted lieutenants and the runners who delivered their daily collections. No written records identified it as part of Bumpy's organization. No telephone calls had ever been made to or from the location. The operation existed in a protective bubble of anonymity that should have made it invisible to law enforcement. Yet the agents who burst through the basement door at precisely 7:15 in the morning knew exactly what they were looking for, exactly where to find it. They bypassed the legitimate barbershop on the ground floor without giving it a second glance. They proceeded directly to the basement entrance hidden behind a false wall in the building's rear storage area. A concealment so effective that building inspectors had walked past it dozens of times without recognizing its existence. The agent's precision suggested intelligence far more detailed than random surveillance could have produced. Bumpy received news of the raid within an hour, delivered by a breathless lieutenant who understood that this kind of failure required immediate reporting. The Godfather listened without visible emotion, asking occasional questions about specific details, mentally cataloging information that might explain how federal agents had penetrated security that should have been impenetrable. Frank Lucas learned about the raid that same afternoon when Bumpy summoned him for what the older man described as a driving assignment that might take several hours. They traveled throughout Harlem, visiting locations that Bumpy rarely inspected personally, the Godfather observing operations with careful attention of someone searching for vulnerabilities he had previously overlooked. At each stop, Bumpy asked questions about security protocols, about who knew what and who had access to which information. Over the following weeks, additional evidence accumulated that someone inside Bumpy's organization was providing information to federal authorities. A meeting at a restaurant on 125th Street was interrupted by agents who arrived precisely 30 minutes after Bumpy and his associates had seated themselves. A shipment of merchandise from downtown was intercepted based on a tip that identified not just the delivery truck, but the specific time it would cross into Harlem. An associate was arrested, leaving his girlfriend's apartment at an address that Bumpy knew had never been documented in any discoverable record. Each incident individually might have been explained through bad luck or exceptional law enforcement work. Collectively, they formed a pattern that pointed unmistakably toward a leak within Bumpy's inner circle. Someone with detailed knowledge of operations, schedules, and personnel was systematically providing that information to the feds. The betrayal wasn't random. It was methodical, ongoing, and devastatingly effective. Frank Lucas observed these developments with particular attention. He drove Bumpy to meetings where damage control was discussed. He waited in outer rooms while the Godfather interrogated lieutenants about security failures. And he noticed something troubling. The pattern of compromised information corresponded almost perfectly with occasions when Bumpy had discussed sensitive matters of the brownstone on 139th Street. The correlation wasn't immediately obvious because Bumpy conducted business at multiple locations. But Frank's position as driver gave him unique insight into the Godfather's schedule, and his memory for details allowed him to reconstruct timelines that others couldn't assemble. The 142nd Street raid had followed a night when Bumpy mentioned that location at the brownstone. The restaurant meeting was discussed during a visit to 139th Street 2 days before agents appeared. The intercepted shipment was planned during an evening when Bumpy had reviewed logistics while Delilah prepared dinner in the adjoining room. Frank didn't want to believe what the evidence suggested because the implications were almost too terrible to contemplate. If Delilah was the leak, then Bumpy's most intimate space had become a surveillance post for federal agents. Every confidence shared in that brownstone, every plan discussed, every name mentioned had potentially been transmitted to people committed to destroying everything the Godfather had built. The possibility haunted Frank during the nights following his realization. He understood that bringing such an accusation to Bumpy required certainty rather than suspicion. Delilah occupied a position in the Godfather's heart that made attacking her dangerous for anyone who couldn't absolutely prove their claims. If Frank was wrong, suggesting that Bumpy's woman was a federal informant would destroy his own position and possibly his life. The investigation Frank conducted over the following weeks demonstrated skills that would serve him well in his later career. He documented every incident of compromised information and mapped it against Bumpy's schedule. He cultivated contacts within the organization who might have noticed unusual behavior around Delilah. He even arranged to observe the brownstone from a distance on occasions when Bumpy wasn't visiting, noting the comings and goings of people whose presence had no obvious explanation. The evidence accumulated over 6 weeks, pointed overwhelmingly toward Delilah's guilt. He identified 3 occasions when a well-dressed white man had visited the brownstone during afternoon hours when Bumpy was occupied elsewhere, visits lasting between 45 minutes and 2 hours that no innocent explanation could justify. He confirmed that every significant intelligence leak corresponded with information discussed in Delilah's presence. He even obtained, through a contact whose discretion he trusted absolutely, confirmation that the Bureau had an active informant within Bumpy's organization. Armed with this evidence, Frank Lucas faced the most difficult conversation of his life. Chapter 3: The Terrible Truth. Bumpy Johnson sat behind the battered wooden desk that had occupied this office for longer than most of his lieutenants had been alive, his weathered hands folded in front of him with the stillness that characterized his demeanor during moments of serious business. The office at the rear of a restaurant on Lenox Avenue was deliberately modest, its atmosphere designed to remind visitors that the Godfather's power derived from substance rather than display. Frank Lucas stood before the desk holding the folder he had assembled over weeks of investigation, acutely aware that the next few minutes would either validate his judgment or end his position in Bumpy's organization. He had rehearsed what he planned to say dozens of times, had settled on a presentation that prioritized evidence over emotion. The Godfather respected facts. If Frank was going to convince Bumpy that Delilah Monroe had betrayed him, the conviction would come through documented proof rather than passionate argument. The conversation began with Frank requesting permission to share something he had discovered during the course of his normal duties. Bumpy nodded without speaking, his eyes fixed on Frank's face with the penetrating attention that made lying to the Godfather essentially impossible. Frank started with the pattern, explaining how he had noticed correlations between compromised operations and information discussed at the brownstone. He walked Bumpy through the timeline of the 142nd Street raid, the interrupted restaurant meeting, the intercepted shipment, demonstrating how each breach followed conversations at 139th Street. He presented the analysis methodically, letting evidence accumulate without drawing explicit conclusions, allowing Bumpy to recognize the pattern himself. When Frank reached the point where he would have to name Delilah specifically, he paused to observe Bumpy's reaction. The Godfather's eyes had shifted slightly, their focus becoming more intense, their attention drilling into Frank with scrutiny that would have wilted most men's resolve. But Frank pressed forward. He described the white man who had visited the brownstone on multiple occasions during Bumpy's absences, providing physical descriptions detailed enough to potentially enable identification. He presented the confirmation about the Bureau's active informant, and he outlined his conclusion, stating clearly that Delilah Monroe had been providing federal agents with information about Bumpy's operations for what appeared to be an extended period. The silence that followed extended for nearly a full minute. Bumpy's jaw had tightened during the description of breaches. Something that might have been pain flickered across his features when Frank spoke Delilah's name in connection with federal cooperation. When Bumpy finally spoke, his voice carried controlled evenness that Frank recognized as the Godfather's most dangerous register. He asked questions that probed the evidence, seeking weaknesses in the analysis, alternative explanations that might account for the patterns without implicating Delilah. The questions were fair and rigorous, and Frank answered each one with detail and precision. He acknowledged areas of uncertainty where they existed. He maintained throughout the tone of someone presenting facts rather than seeking to convince. The questioning continued for nearly an hour, Bumpy systematically testing every element of Frank's case. But the evidence was comprehensive and mutually reinforcing. The pattern of compromised information, the correlation with brownstone discussions, the unexplained visits from a stranger, the confirmed existence of an informant. Together, they constructed a case that couldn't be explained away regardless of how desperately Bumpy might have wished otherwise. Bumpy's final question surprised Frank with its directness. He asked whether Frank understood what bringing this information forward might mean for Delilah if the accusation proved accurate. Frank answered honestly that he had considered those implications carefully, that his loyalty to Bumpy required honesty even when honesty was painful, that watching the organization be destroyed from within while remaining silent would have been a greater betrayal than the one Delilah had committed. The Godfather rose from behind his desk and walked to the window overlooking the alley, his back to Frank as he spoke words that would remain with the younger man for the rest of his life. Bumpy explained that he had suspected something was wrong for months, had sensed betrayal without being able to identify its source. Frank's investigation had confirmed fears that Bumpy had been reluctant to examine too closely. What happened next, Bumpy continued, would test whether his organization possessed resilience to survive a threat from within. External enemies could be fought with conventional weapons. Informants required different tactics, strategies that turned the instrument of betrayal back against those who believed they were exploiting it. Delilah thought she was helping the feds destroy Bumpy Johnson. She was about to learn that the Godfather had survived worse threats than a beautiful woman with divided loyalties. Chapter 4. The Godfather's Response. 3 weeks passed between Frank's presentation and the evening when Bumpy Johnson finally confronted the truth he had been avoiding. During that interval, the Godfather had conducted his own investigation through channels invisible to everyone except those whose loyalty had been tested beyond doubt. He verified every element of Frank's evidence and discovered additional details, painting an even more damning picture of Delilah's betrayal. The intelligence Bumpy gathered revealed the full architecture of Delilah's arrangement with Special Agent Robert Harrigan. He learned about the bank account growing steadily with each piece of information she delivered. He discovered the precise categories of intelligence she had provided. He obtained transcripts of conversations where Delilah had discussed the Godfather with contempt that revealed how little genuine affection existed beneath her performed devotion. The woman who had whispered endearments in his bed had been mocking him to federal agents who recorded her disdain for posterity. The depth of this betrayal might have broken a weaker man, might have provoked rage that clouds judgment and produces decisions that satisfy emotion while sacrificing strategy. Bumpy Johnson was not a weak man. He absorbed the confirmation with the same controlled demeanor he had maintained throughout Frank's presentation, processing information that wounded him profoundly while calculating how to transform that wound into a weapon. The plan Bumpy developed demonstrated why he had survived and thrived in an environment that destroyed most men. Rather than eliminating Delilah immediately, which would satisfy vengeance, but waste an opportunity, Bumpy decided to use her continued access to federal agents as a channel for delivering misinformation that would damage the very operation she believed she was supporting. Delilah thought she was betraying Bumpy Johnson. She was about to become an unwitting double agent whose greatest betrayal would be against the people who had recruited her. The execution required patience and precision that few men possessed. Bumpy began altering the information Delilah had access to, conducting conversations in her presence that contained carefully constructed falsehoods, mixed with enough accurate details to maintain credibility. He discussed non-existent operations as though they were real, named fictional associates as active participants in his organization, outlined plans that would lead federal agents toward targets that didn't exist while actual operations continued undisturbed. Delilah noticed nothing unusual because she had grown comfortable in her role as informant, confident that her position was secure and her deception undetected. She continued meeting with Harrigan, continued delivering intelligence that she believed was damaging Bumpy's organization. Each piece of information she provided was exactly what Bumpy intended her to transmit, carefully crafted to achieve specific objectives that Delilah couldn't perceive. The effects of Bumpy's disinformation campaign became apparent within weeks. Federal agents raided locations where they expected to find criminal operations and discovered empty rooms or legitimate businesses with no connection to organized crime. Surveillance teams staked out addresses that led to nothing. Investigations consumed resources pursuing leads that terminated in dead ends. The Bureau's Harlem operation, which had been building momentum through Delilah's cooperation, began experiencing failures that damaged credibility and provoked internal questions about intelligence reliability. Harrigan noticed the pattern before his supervisors did, recognizing that information from his carefully cultivated informant had suddenly become worthless. The operations she reported were phantoms. The associates she named were ghosts. What he couldn't bring himself to consider was that Bumpy Johnson had discovered her betrayal and was using her as a weapon against her own handlers. While the federal operation floundered, Bumpy simultaneously arranged the exposure of several corrupt officers within the New York Police Department who had been cooperating with Harrigan's investigation. These officers had provided the Bureau with local support that enhanced their effectiveness. Bumpy had known about their corruption for years and tolerated it, because exposing them would have created more problems. Now, they became pawns in a larger game, sacrificed to damage infrastructure supporting the investigation threatening him. The exposure happened through channels that couldn't be traced back to Bumpy's organization. Anonymous tips to journalists and internal affairs investigators providing documentation of payoffs, fabricated evidence, and civil rights violations. The resulting scandal consumed attention, forced agent reassignments, and created bureaucratic chaos that paralyzed the investigation Delilah had been feeding. Throughout these maneuvers, Bumpy continued visiting the brownstone as though nothing had changed, maintained his relationship with Delilah with the same apparent warmth, revealed nothing through word or deed that might alert her to the reversal in their positions. The discipline required would have defeated most men, but Bumpy had survived decades in an environment demanding constant performance. Frank Lucas observed these developments from his position as driver and trusted associate, understanding that Bumpy was executing a strategy whose full dimensions remained invisible even to senior figures. He learned from Bumpy's example that revenge could be strategic rather than emotional, that the satisfaction of immediate violence often paled compared to the comprehensive destruction that patience could achieve. Chapter 5: The Reckoning. The confrontation Bumpy arranged occurred on a Friday evening in late March, timed to coincide with developments that would make the conversation's impact impossible for Delilah to escape or deny. He arrived at the brownstone at his usual hour, entered through the door he had passed through hundreds of times, and found Delilah waiting in the living room, anticipating a routine evening. She had prepared dinner, arranged intimate lighting, dressed in silk he had purchased during happier times. The Godfather's demeanor revealed nothing unusual as he accepted Delilah's greeting and settled into his customary chair. He asked about her day with casual interest, gave no indication this evening would differ from any other they had shared. Delilah interpreted his manner as confirmation that her secret remained safe, that the federal operation continued advancing toward objectives that would eventually eliminate the man sitting across from her. The transition from routine conversation to devastating revelation happened with suddenness that left Delilah no time to prepare defenses. Bumpy mentioned casually that he had heard interesting news about a federal investigation into Harlem criminal activities, a conversational gambit that seemed unremarkable until he began describing details with specificity that shouldn't have been possible. He named Robert Harrigan as the supervising agent. He described the intelligence collection operation running for nearly 2 years. He outlined the bank account established to compensate a particularly valuable informant, and he identified that informant by name. Delilah's face underwent a transformation that Bumpy observed with detached interest of a scientist watching an experiment produce expected results. Confusion gave way to recognition, recognition to fear, fear to panic calculation, searching for escape routes that didn't exist. She attempted denials that collapsed under the weight of details demonstrating he knew everything about her arrangement with federal agents. But Bumpy's revelation extended beyond simply confirming he knew about her betrayal. He explained what he had done with that knowledge during the 2 months since her activities were discovered. He described the disinformation campaign that had used her as an unwitting channel for intelligence designed to destroy the operation she believed she was supporting. He detailed operations that had failed because agents pursued non-existent targets, surveillance wasted monitoring meaningless locations, careers damaged by reliance on worthless intelligence. The realization that she had been transformed from valuable informant to instrument of the operation's destruction produced visible impact exceeding anything the initial revelation caused. She had spent months believing she was advancing toward objectives, providing security and independence. In reality, she had been dismantling those objectives herself, delivering information that damaged the people she was trying to help while protecting the man she was trying to destroy. Bumpy continued by describing consequences awaiting her outside brownstone walls. Harrigan's career was effectively over, his reputation for intelligence assessment destroyed. Documentation would be delivered to every remaining figure in the federal operation, identifying Delilah as the source of intelligence failures, marking her as someone whose association carried professional danger for anyone connected to her. But destruction of her relationship with federal handlers represented only one dimension of consequences Bumpy had arranged. Word of her betrayal would spread through channels he controlled, would reach every significant figure in the neighborhood's criminal and legitimate communities, would mark her as someone who had informed on the Godfather of Harlem. The social position she had enjoyed, the respect she had commanded, the access she had possessed to circles that mattered, all would disappear overnight, replaced by contempt reserved for informants in communities where informing represented ultimate transgression. The financial dimensions of her destruction were equally comprehensive. The brownstone belonged to Bumpy through corporate structures she had never understood. She would vacate it within the week or find herself physically removed. The allowance would cease immediately. She would emerge from this confrontation with nothing but clothes and whatever she could carry in her hands. Delilah's attempts to negotiate, to offer explanations, to appeal for mercy on grounds of affection they had shared, met responses demonstrating how completely Bumpy had assessed and dismissed such possibilities. He explained calmly that her betrayal had murdered whatever feelings he had possessed for her, had transformed the woman he remembered loving into a stranger whose existence offended him. He owed her nothing except the consequences her actions had earned. The evening concluded with Bumpy's departure from a brownstone, a final exit from premises he would never enter again. He left Delilah sitting alone in a living room that no longer belonged to her, contemplating a future containing nothing but wreckage of everything she had attempted to build. Chapter 6: The Victory. The aftermath of Bumpy Johnson's confrontation with Delilah Monroe unfolded across following months with the inevitability of natural process that human intervention couldn't alter. She vacated the brownstone within the deadline Bumpy had specified, removing herself to a small apartment in Brooklyn that represented the maximum her remaining resources could sustain. The possessions she managed to retain were sold gradually to finance an existence bearing no resemblance to the lifestyle she had enjoyed as the Godfather's mistress. The woman who had once commanded attention on Harlem streets became invisible, avoided by people who had previously sought her company, abandoned by a community that had learned what she had done. The federal operation that Delilah's cooperation had supported collapsed under accumulated weight of failures that her misinformation had caused. Harrigan was reassigned to a field office in the Midwest, a professional exile from which his career never recovered. The investigation into Bumpy's organization was officially suspended pending reassessment of intelligence sources, bureaucratic designation that effectively acknowledged defeat without explicitly admitting that the Godfather had outmaneuvered federal law enforcement. Resources dedicated to the Harlem operation were redirected toward targets that seemed more promising, leaving Bumpy's empire intact and functional. Word of what had happened spread through New York's criminal underworld with the speed that significant events always traveled through such networks. The story became legend, told and retold with embellishments that sometimes exceeded the already impressive reality. Bumpy Johnson had discovered a federal informant in his own bed. He had transformed her into a weapon against her handlers. He had dismantled the operation targeting him without firing a single shot or spilling a single drop of blood. The tale reinforced his reputation as someone whose intelligence and strategic capability exceeded the crude violence that characterized lesser criminals. Frank Lucas observed the story's evolution with understanding of someone who had played a crucial role in events being transformed into mythology. His position within Bumpy's organization had strengthened considerably following successful identification of Delilah's betrayal. The Godfather demonstrated appreciation through increased responsibility, greater access, and implicit recognition that Frank had proven himself trustworthy under circumstances that tested loyalty absolutely. The relationship between mentor and protege deepened as Bumpy began sharing knowledge and perspective he had previously reserved for himself. The lessons Frank absorbed during this period would influence his own approach to power in ways becoming apparent only years later. He learned that information was more valuable than muscle, that understanding your enemy's operations could defeat them more effectively than confronting them directly, that patience often achieved what immediate action couldn't accomplish. He watched Bumpy navigate the aftermath of Delilah's betrayal with steady hand of someone who had survived worse challenges and expected to survive whatever came next. Bumpy's health continued its gradual decline during months following his victory over the federal operation. The toll of decades spent managing violence and evading law enforcement had accumulated in ways medical science couldn't reverse. He experienced episodes of chest pain that physicians attributed to a heart weakened by years of stress. His energy diminished perceptibly. The Godfather was approaching the end of his reign, though his mind remained as sharp as it had ever been. The knowledge of his own mortality influenced how Bumpy spent his remaining time. He began transferring knowledge more deliberately to those he trusted, sharing insights about operations and relationships and strategies he had previously kept private. Frank Lucas was among primary beneficiaries of this knowledge transfer, receiving education in the architecture of power that would serve him when he eventually built his own organization. Delilah Monroe's fate served as persistent reminder of consequences awaiting those who betrayed the Godfather's trust. She lived in diminished circumstances, cut off from communities that had previously defined her existence. The federal agents who had recruited her wanted nothing to do with someone whose cooperation had produced such catastrophic failures. The criminal world she had inhabited during her years with Bumpy had permanently expelled her. She existed in limbo, neither dead nor truly alive, serving as an example that everyone who knew the story would remember. The evening when Frank Lucas truly understood the significance of what he had witnessed occurred several weeks after Delilah's exposure, during a drive through Harlem streets that had no particular destination. Bumpy sat in the back seat, as he always did, watching the neighborhood pass outside windows he had looked through for decades. The Godfather spoke during that drive about what had happened with Delilah, not repeating details Frank already knew, but offering perspective that transformed events into lessons. He explained that capacity to survive betrayal was more important than capacity to prevent it, because betrayal was inevitable in a world where everyone had interests that might diverge from yours. He described how his response was designed not merely to punish Delilah, but to strengthen his position by demonstrating capabilities that enemies would remember before attempting similar attacks. And he emphasized that victory was never final, that maintaining power required constant vigilance against threats that would continue emerging regardless of how thoroughly previous threats had been defeated. Frank listened to these words with attention of someone receiving instruction from a master whose teachings might not be available much longer. He understood that Bumpy was preparing him for a future when the Godfather would no longer be present to provide guidance. Bumpy Johnson would die the following year, his heart finally failing during a meal at a restaurant he had frequented for decades. Frank Lucas would go on to build his own criminal empire, eventually becoming one of the most notorious drug traffickers in American history before his own fall and transformation into government informant. The lessons learned during the Delilah affair would influence how Frank approached both his rise and his eventual decisions about cooperation with authorities. But on that evening drive through Harlem's changing streets, with the Godfather still alive and still teaching and still demonstrating why he had earned his title, the future remained unwritten. What existed in that moment was the reality of victory achieved through intelligence rather than violence, patience rather than rage, strategy rather than impulse. Bumpy Johnson had discovered that the woman he loved was destroying his empire. He had transformed her into a weapon against her own handlers. He had emerged from the crisis stronger than he entered it. and he had shown Frank Lucas what true power looked like, lessons that would echo through decades of criminal history, yet to unfold. The story of what Bumpy Johnson did when he learned his mistress was a snitch became one of many legends that surrounded the Godfather of Harlem. It was told in barbershops and bars, in prison yards and corner conversations, passed from those who claimed first-hand knowledge to those who would repeat it with their own embellishments added. The details shifted with each telling, but the essential truth remained consistent. Bumpy Johnson had faced betrayal from within his most intimate circle and had responded with a sophistication that lesser men couldn't comprehend. He had won not through violence that everyone expected, but through the intelligence that defined him. That was the story New York never forgot. That was how the Godfather of Harlem handled a woman who thought she could destroy him. That was why, for generations afterward, people understood that Bumpy Johnson was different from ordinary criminals, that his mind was more dangerous than any weapon, that crossing him meant facing consequences that death would have been easier than enduring.